Okay, in this lesson, we will be talking about the death penalty and who doesn't enjoy a good argument about the death penalty. So, I think this is an interesting topic. It is a very controversial topic, particularly in America, where people who like the death penalty really, really like the death penalty, and the people who are opposed to the death penalty really, really are opposed to the death penalty. So, we're going to go over some just brief statistics, a little history, some court cases, and then we'll talk about some of the arguments for the death penalty and the arguments against the death penalty. One of the unfortunate consequences of 120 online is that we don't get to watch How to Kill a Human Being together. It's 55 minutes. It is a great documentary by BBC, and it is a former member of British Parliament who goes around investigating how exactly people die through the different means of execution. So, how is it you die from hanging? How exactly do you die through electrocution, gas, lethal injection? It's really interesting. It is available on DVD in the library. So, if you're able and you have a DVD player at this point, I recommend checking it out. It's just 55 minutes. It's a really great video, and it's really interesting. All right, well, as I'm sure you know, throughout history, capital punishment has been used as a penalty for crimes. Sometimes those crimes were very minor, usually not, though. So, again, as we've talked about, a lot of textbooks and people like to really play up all the violence and agony of corrections and criminal justice prior to the Enlightenment and prior to modern times. But sometimes it gets a little overblown. So certainly, especially in England and London, as during the Industrial Revolution, you saw a lot of crimes, a lot of property crimes. Things got out of hand, and punishments definitely got out of hand as well, where people were executed for a lot of property offenses, things we would not consider to be proportional at this point. And then, of course, with the Enlightenment, you had all kinds of new theories on crime and punishment. Foremost, of course, is the idea of deterrence. Cesar Beccaria talking about deterrence, and that was one of the reasons he argued against the death penalty. He said the death penalty doesn't have a deterrent effect, that people might go out, watch a public execution, and they might be deterred for a day or two, say, oh, I don't want to be that guy. But then that lesson gets forgotten. And his belief was that by incarcerating someone in prison over a long period, that provided a constant reminder to people of the consequences for committing crimes. The other big argument against the death penalty for at least a lot of crimes was the growth in the interest in proportionality, so that torture was no longer considered proportional to the offenses. The death penalty was not considered proportional to, say, property crimes, and so there was this desire to me, actually return to proportional crimes, because, of course, a lot of the ancient uh, legal systems, they were very concerned with proportionality. It's really when things got a little out of hand, the monarchy tended to be a little disproportionate for some things. And then, of course, during the big crime spike in London, things definitely got a little disproportionate as well. So, worldwide, Amnesty International estimates, and these are estimates, that there were about 690 executions in 2018. What's interesting is this was a huge drop from 2017 and the lowest number that they've recorded in the last decade. Importantly, that probably, and it's hard to know, is that doesn't include China. And China, we're not exactly sure how many people China executes, but China executes a lot, and they are responsible for at least half of the world's executions. And China, Iran, Saudi Arabia, the US, and Pakistan together are responsible for 95% of the known executions. So again, there's a lot of people believe a lot of executions in China that we just don't know about. That it's kind of a state secret. It's interesting too is if you get online, you can look it up. China has been accused of harvesting organs so that they will execute prisoners and then they'll harvest their organs and sell them basically to people who need organs. People from outside China will come to China specifically to get organs transplanted and whatnot. And a lot of those organs come from convicted criminals. Some are from like Falun Gong, like they're from groups that are sort of considered enemies of the state, not even necessarily like capital offenders as you might normally think of them. So the death penalty has been abolished in law or in practice in more than 135 countries. So some countries still have the death penalty on the books, but they don't actually implement it. So for instance, Belize had the death penalty, they got rid of the death penalty, then they actually brought it back, but they've not actually executed anybody under that law. And so it's still used in about 60 countries. So more countries don't use it at this point than do use it. So here's a nice little number from a little graph from 2017, where this is from Amnesty International. And again, it's not clear how many people China has executed, but generally speaking, it's generally assumed to be responsible for about half of the world's executions. So you can see China, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Pakistan, Egypt, Somalia, the United States, Jordan, and Singapore. So that's interesting company that we keep when it comes to really a lot of criminal justice and specifically corrections practices, but with the death penalty in particular. And if from your Sky Pack, it talks that provides the death penalty retentionists, those who still have the death penalty. And again, it's Afghanistan, Bahrain, Belarus, Bangladesh, et cetera, et cetera. And then the countries that have abolished it. And this is where the entire European Union, all the European countries have abolished the death penalty, along with lots of other countries. So that's an interesting thing to think about, is the company we keep when it comes to the death penalty. And North Korea, China, if these are in fact Iran, Iraq, these are the countries that we really feel comfortable associating ourselves with versus Norway, Iceland, Ireland, England, Sweden, Switzerland, all the European countries, and really a lot of the African countries, and well, just the majority of countries. Okay, so how do we kill people in the U.S.? And this is in the U.S., so this will be primarily how it's done in America, but in other countries, there are additional means like beheading. Occasionally, you'll see in the news somebody is stoned to death in a country with Sharia law. But in the United States, lethal injection is the predominant method. It's used in all the states that have the death penalty. It was first adopted in 1977 by Oklahoma. And what's interesting, too, with Oklahoma is I believe they were the first state to adopt asphyxiation, nitrogen asphyxiation, as an alternative to the lethal injection. And the reason why they did that is because lethal injection is in something of a crisis for several reasons. One is the Hippocratic Oath, which, if you don't know, that is the oath that all medical professionals take to first do no harm. So because of the Hippocratic Oath, they cannot be involved in administering lethal injection. So you end up with EMTs doing it, who sometimes don't have the same practice and skill set at giving those sorts of injections. And so because of that, that's one of the reasons you will sometimes see in the news where a lethal injection gets botched, where somebody will go like through the vein, they'll miss the vein, they'll go in the opposite direction that you're supposed to inject it, against the flow of the blood. And it ends up being, they can be pretty gnarly executions. Also, there's growing evidence that the drugs might actually be really, really painful. So generally, it's a cocktail of 3 drugs, one that sort of paralyzes you, and then one that knocks you out, and then one that stops your heart. And it turns out that after you're paralyzed, the next drug might actually be horribly, horribly painful, like your body is on fire. But you don't know that. Nobody can tell because you're completely paralyzed, but you're also conscious. And so there's some issues with that. And then finally, drug manufacturers. So when we think about the death penalty in the United States, generally we just limit our views to the United States. But of course, the world is a increasingly smaller and smaller place, and some of the drugs used for lethal injection come from pharmaceutical companies that are based in Europe. And the EU has banned capital punishment, and those companies will not sell their drugs if they're going to be used for lethal injection. And so that was one of the real crises that, like Oklahoma and some states face. They actually could not find the drugs for administering lethal injection. And so they're coming up with alternatives like nitrogen asphyxiation and things like that. Electrocution is still an option. So any of these other ones are options, but the lethal injection is still the primary mode. And then the issue is, well, you've got these other options to fall back on if, for instance, they can't get the drug or need it or something like that. So this actually, I took this picture in the Indiana State Museum, and it is the electric chair that was used in Indiana. And what's interesting too is, as you can see here from the little placard that was with it, the wooden parts come from the the gallows that was used in Indiana as well. So they used to hang people. And then when they stopped doing that, they used the wood to build this electric chair. So down here you can see 9 states still have electrocution as an option, but again, lethal injection is the primary means. 6 states still have lethal gas. 11 people have been killed since 1976 using lethal gas, but that's a very rare option. Hanging, very rare option. The last one was Billy Bailey in 1996. And then the firing squad. So 3 states have this, and only 3 people have been killed. And recently, Utah brought back the firing squad a few years back. And that's what this story is. And if you access this PowerPoint slide online, you can click on that. It's less than 5 minutes. It's a pretty interesting story talking about witnessing the last time somebody was executed in Utah with the firing squad. So, that's worth checking out. So today, 29 states, the military and the federal government still allow capital punishment. The other states do not. And as you may or may not know, the federal executions are carried out at Terre Haute. So because Indiana is one of the 29 states with the death penalty, Terre Haute is a federal penitentiary. And so Timothy McVeigh was executed in Terre Haute quite a while ago now, I guess. So the first person to be executed in the U.S. after the moratorium ended on the death penalty, and that's what we're going to talk about, is that moratorium, where the death penalty became unconstitutional for a few years and then was reinstated. And Gary Gilmore was the first person to die, and he was killed by the firing squad in Utah. So the death penalty has actually been dropping quite a bit lately, the number of death sentences. And one of the main reasons for that is increasingly juries are opting for life without parole. And so if you click on this, and again, you can access these publications. If you just go to the PowerPoint slides. Any minute now. So here's the Sentencing Project, which is always a good source for information. But they have an actual table where you can see, there you go, the number of life sentences. And here's life with parole. And then that also you can get life without parole. And life without parole is just that. That means you will die in prison. And then this idea of virtual life is you weren't given a life sentence, but you were given a long enough sentence that, given the average lifespan, you will most likely die in prison. So there's a virtual life sentence. And that's a really interesting issue because juveniles cannot be given a life sentence, but sometimes they end up getting virtual life sentences, and they actually shouldn't be given virtual life sentences either. And there's some debate as to, well, what constitutes a virtual life sentence for a juvenile. So anyways, you can see the growth from 1984 to 2016, quite a bit of growth in the use of just the life sentence. And then another great source, and you can access this online as well, is deathpenaltyinfo.org. They are against the death penalty, but they do provide a lot of good information. And so here you can see where the death penalty in America, so here 0 in 1976 because it was unconstitutional, and then it kicks back in 77, that's Gary Gilmore, and then you can see this peak in 1990. 98, 99, and then after that it's been going down and down and down, and consequently, or at the same time, life without parole has been going up, because in the end 2/3 of Americans, about 65% of Americans, support the death penalty. But when you're actually on the jury and you have to make that decision, turns out if a jury is given the option of life without parole, they'll opt for that instead, and increasingly they're opting for that. And that's one of the reasons is because, of course, there's been a lot of mistakes that we've exonerated people through DNA who have been falsely convicted. And so if you make a mistake and kill somebody, there's no remediating that mistake. If you make a mistake and that person's in prison, life without parole, then of course you can let them out. So you can also get this information on the race. And what's interesting that we'll talk about is it was one of the reasons it was made unconstitutional was that it was racially biased, that African Americans were a lot more likely to be executed for the same crime as white defendants. And so that was one of the reasons why it became unconstitutional. However, what they have found more recently is it's not so much the race of the defendant that matters, but actually the race of the victim. And so killing a white person increases the odds substantially of being executed. So killing a white person is a lot more likely to wind up with a death sentence than killing a non-white. And so that was actually the basis for another challenge more recently against the death penalty. And here you can see some sites for studies. Jurors in Washington State are 3 times more likely to recommend a death sentence for a black defendant than for a white defendant. In Louisiana, the odds of a death sentence were 97% higher for those whose victim was white than for those whose victim was black. A study in California found that those convicted of killing whites were 3 times more likely to be sentenced to death as those convicted of killing blacks, and 4 times more likely than those convicted of killing Latinos. So that's pretty crazy, right? And so we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. And then another interesting thing that I don't think people realize is that it actually costs more to execute someone than to lock them up for the rest of their lives. So it's actually cheaper just to put someone in prison for life without parole than it is to execute them. And the main reason for that is the defense costs, that the appeals, there's usually multiple appeals, and so that requires just a lot of fees and salaries and whatnot to go through. Meanwhile, of course, the person is still locked up. So on average, it takes about 14 years to execute someone from the time they've actually been sentenced to death until they're killed. So that 14 years, they're being incarcerated in maximum security, right, on death row for that 14 years. So you're paying for basically this 14 years of a life sentence while going through all these really expensive appeals. And so here you can see that Oklahoma capital cases cost on average 3 times more likely than non-capital cases. Defense costs for death penalty trials in Kansas averaged $400,000 per case compared to $100,000 when the death penalty was not sought. Enforcing the death penalty cost Florida $51 million a year, above what it would cost to punish all first-degree murderers with life in prison without parole. So that's, I think, an interesting point that a lot of people don't fully appreciate, is how much more expensive it is to execute someone than to just simply give them life without parole. All right, so you only need to know a few cases, but you do need to know these. So there's lots of interesting Supreme Court cases around the death penalty in terms of you're not allowed to execute juveniles. You can't execute what were at the time when the decision was made called mentally retarded, but mentally disabled individuals, developmentally disabled. But the main ones you need to know is Furman v. Georgia. because Furman v. Georgia made the death penalty unconstitutional. So this was Furman v. Georgia 1972, but they didn't say the death penalty was unconstitutional per se. They said it was unconstitutional as administered, and it violated cruel and unusual punishment. It violated the Eighth Amendment. And the problem was they found that the statute, the law for the death penalty, provided no guidelines for the judge or the jury. They just like, there you go, give it or don't give it. It's up to you. And so it had been imposed really discriminatorily, where African Americans, minorities, non-whites were much more likely to be executed than whites for the same crime. So 40 death penalty statutes across the country were voided, and everybody's sentence was commuted to life in prison. So 629 death sentences across the country were all commuted to life sentences. So the states responded in one of two ways. They either enacted a mandatory death statute or guided discretion. So a mandatory just means if you were found guilty of a capital offense, which would be murder, then you get the death penalty no matter what. And so that way, for them, that eliminated this whole problem of bias and arbitrary imposition of the death penalty. And then the other approach was guided discretion. They said, well, instead of giving states this, or the juries and judges, freedom, provide guidelines for how they make that decision and certain criteria that need to be followed. So the mandatory death penalty was rejected by the Supreme Court. And that also then struck down Indiana, as Indiana had tried to do that. And there were a couple of cases. You don't need to know these cases, but Woodson v. North Carolina and Roberts v. Louisiana are the cases that struck down the mandatory death penalty. And their argument was, you can't just kill someone without considering the someone. You can't treat all capital offenses as the exact same and just execute every single person. So instead, though, Gregg v. Georgia, 1976, reinstated the death penalty, provided the death penalty laws have this other option, this sort of guided discretion. So death penalty laws are okay if they consider mitigating and aggravating circumstances when deciding which murderer should be executed. So you've got to consider mitigating and aggravating circumstances. There has to be a bifurcated trial, and that's where the trial is split into two phases, or two separate trials, really. One is to establish guilt or innocence, and then the second trial is to establish the sentence if the person's found guilty. So once you're found guilty, there is now a second trial to decide whether or not you get the death penalty, life without parole, whatever the options are in that state and what the prosecution is trying to get. But it has to be a separate trial now. And then also automatic appellate review. So if you are found guilty of a capital offense, once you receive the death sentence, that is automatically appealed. You don't even have a choice. As a defendant, if you're sentenced to death, your case is automatically kicked to the appeals court, and the appeals court reviews the decision to make sure that your rights were protected when that happened. So mitigating circumstances are things that basically reduce the culpability or the severity in some ways of the offense. So mitigating circumstances, and they vary from states, but they're all more or less the same. So something like if the defendant has no significant criminal justice history. So if this woman just one-off smashes her husband's head in with a frying pan, but has never had another run-in with the law or anything like that, that's a mitigating circumstance. So again, that doesn't exonerate the individual by any stretch. It's just one of the circumstances you have to consider in whether or not you're going to execute the defendant. So the defendant is under extreme mental or emotional disturbance. The defendant was an accomplice whose role was relatively minor. So you can not kill somebody, but be involved in a crime where somebody gets killed, and you could be found guilty. So again, the issue is whether or not you'll be executed for that, or whether you'll just get a prison sentence for that, or the defendant under extreme duress. So aggravating circumstances are circumstances that aggravate it, right? That make you more morally culpable or the crime more severe. So if you commit a capital felony while under criminal justice control. So let's say you're on parole or probation and you kill someone, that's an aggravating circumstance. So if you've been previously convicted, sadly, you can actually, that's an aggravating circumstance. You can have a previous conviction for a capital offense or a violent felony. And then if you get reconvicted, then that's another aggravating, right? If you commit a capital felony in order to avoid arrest, so you kill somebody while trying to escape arrest. Homicide that was calculated. So this is where this whole idea of premeditated, calculated murder versus one where they're, again, you just sort of one-off smash your husband's head in, but there was no plan to do that. Or you kill somebody who is a public official performing their official duties. So it would be like, say, a police officer or a prison guard who is performing their duties as a prison guard or a police officer. So that would be separate from, say, killing somebody in a bar who also happened to be a prison guard or a police officer, but actually killing them while they were performing their official duties. So those are examples of aggravating circumstances. Another important case is McCleskey v. Kemp, and this was more recent, and this is where, again, previously it had been found unconstitutional because it was so biased on the defendants, so that minority defendants were much more likely to be executed than white defendants. This was that other issue. McCleskey v. Kemp, they raised this other issue where we still have a little bit of that, but what seems to be even bigger now is that it's the race of the victim, so that killing a white person is a lot more likely to result in a death sentence than killing a non-white person. And so they said, look, you have the same problem where it's biased, it's discriminatory. And in this case, the Supreme Court rejected that argument. And that's important, just for that reason, that they said pattern of racial bias is not enough. You have to actually show that in your specific case, there was racial bias. So showing that the death penalty is racially biased, that it's implemented in a racially biased format, that where non-white defendants are more likely to get the death penalty for a similar crime, and that people who've killed white victims are more likely to get a death penalty in an otherwise similar crime. They said, no, you've got to show that in your specific case, the jury or the judge or the prosecutor or the police or somebody, that there was actually demonstrable racial bias in your case by somebody. And more importantly, though, is that what that also did was that basically threw social science out of the courtroom, because patterns is what social science does, right? Social science isn't involved in one individual and what happens in one individual case. Science, generally, social science and the natural sciences, are really about patterns and about probabilities and predicting and demonstrating overall patterns. And so once the Supreme Court said patterns don't matter, they basically said social science is irrelevant to making this decision. And so I think that's an interesting point that sometimes gets overlooked in that case. So those are the cases you need to know: Gregg v. Georgia, Furman v. Georgia, McCleskey v. Kemp. You should know those cases. Indiana and the death penalty. Indiana has the death penalty. It allows the death penalty for murder with aggravating circumstances. There have been 20 executions since the death penalty was reinstated in 1977. In total in Indiana, 94 people have been executed. Right. Also, sometimes there are federal executions in Indiana. Terre Haute, right? Timothy McVeigh was executed in Terre Haute. And so sometimes if you find statistics about the number of executions in Indiana, sometimes it'll be a little bit higher because you'll see these federal executions also included. But as far as actual state executions, it's been 94 total. There have been 20 executions since 1977, but almost 100 death sentences, right? So as we'll learn, it takes a very long time, on average about 14 years, depending on the state, between the time you get the death penalty and it actually is carried out. So you will have a lot more, in any state, a lot more death sentences than actual executions. So currently there are 11 prisoners on death row. One is a woman, Deborah Denise Brown, and she's been on death row since 1986, but she probably will not get executed here. She is incarcerated in Ohio as part of a crime spree that she was involved in with her boyfriend at the time, who has been executed in the state of Ohio. So in Indiana, the method is injection, and like most states, it uses 3 drugs: Brevital, pancuronium, and then potassium chloride. What's interesting about potassium chloride is if you look that up, that actually has been used as a salt substitute. So in fact, I grew up, we had a very heart-friendly diet because my dad had had open heart surgery and heart attacks. And so we actually had potassium chloride that we would consume instead of salt a lot of times as a salt substitute. In high enough doses, it will kill you. And if you want more information on that, there is Indiana IDOC, Department of Corrections, has great information on there. So I just wanted to show the case of Deborah Denise Brown. I'm going to give you a chance to read this. And this is the crime for which she has been sentenced to death. So this is the crime spree. This is the specific crime for which Deborah Denise Brown received the death penalty in Indiana. It was part of this bigger crime spree for which both Coleman and Brown were incarcerated in Ohio. Coleman was executed in Ohio, and Denise Brown will probably remain there for the rest of her life. Indiana has requested that she be sent here for execution, and recently they actually dropped that request. So at this point, she'll probably remain there. So I think this is important because, when we talk about the various reasons for punishment, deterrence, just desserts, restoration, all these different reasons, one of the only strong arguments for the death penalty is just desserts. When you see a crime like this, it's hard to argue that something like the death penalty isn't a fair and just punishment, right? How else do you find justice through a crime? This is just one of many crimes, right? How do you find justice for this sort of horrific offense? And so a lot of the proponents of the death penalty would argue, well, this is exactly what the death penalty was made for. This is the only way. This is the only way you can have justice. This is the only way there can be justice and just desserts is through retribution. So what's also, though, interesting and needs to keep in mind is that she's intellectually disabled. And according to the Supreme Court, we cannot execute intellectually disabled, formerly referred to as mentally retarded, defendants, right? That's unconstitutional. The problem is the Supreme Court didn't do a very good job of defining exactly what that is. And so states have to come to that decision. Judges and juries have to come to that decision. And that's where people like forensic psychologists and others come in and they testify during these sorts of cases. And some will testify that somebody is too intellectually disabled to be executed. Somebody else will come in and testify that no, they're not. They can be executed. And that's one of the components of, say, forensic psychology. Her father also suffered mental illness and beat her as a child. She overdosed on drugs at 18, and Alton Coleman, her boyfriend, who was listed in there, beat her, prostituted her. And so those would be what you would consider mitigating circumstances, right? And so when you see all that, then it starts to get a lot shadier and more difficult to make that decision. Well, should she be executed? If she is in fact intellectually disabled, it's unconstitutional. These other issues then are basically mitigating circumstances. a father who beats her, a boyfriend who prostitutes her and dominates and beats her. She has a serious drug problem for years. Those become mitigating circumstances. And then that's what, in the bifurcated trial, that's what you have to consider as all these other instances, these other circumstances. Another big issue that's come up recently is, of course, with the increase in DNA evidence, is the exoneration of innocent people on death row. And I think wherever you stand on the death penalty, everybody agrees nobody wants to execute an innocent person. And a 2009 Gallup poll demonstrated that almost 60% of respondents actually believed that we have executed someone in the past 5 years who is innocent of the crime. What's interesting is about 65% of people support the death penalty. So roughly 2/3 of people support the death penalty, and roughly 2/3 of people believe we've executed someone innocent in the past 5 years, which is to say there's a sizable chunk of people who are okay ultimately with executing an innocent person. Because if you support the death penalty and you acknowledge that we've accidentally executed someone innocent, then by definition you're willing to accept that as sort of a cost to the policy, which I find kind of interesting. Since 1973, over 140 people condemned to death have been exonerated by DNA and released. This is why the former governor of Illinois, back when actually we lived there, right before he was sent to prison, he actually commuted the death penalty of the death sentence of everybody in Illinois, because DNA evidence started to exonerate enough of them that he just felt that it just wasn't a viable option at that point, that it was without a doubt there were going to be innocent people who were going to be executed. So, when people have their death sentence commuted, it just gets commuted to life, usually life without parole. And so nobody gets out of prison, but they're no longer going to be executed. So the people who are opposed to the death penalty, abolitionists, they say, look, this is the failure. The death penalty doesn't work. We can't do this. We're at some point we're going to execute innocent people. On the other hand, proponents of the death penalty say, well, no, the fact that they've been exonerated is exactly proof that the system works, that these mistakes have been corrected, and that we have this system with multiple appeals that helps to prevent these sorts of miscarriages of justice. So again, depending on where you stand is how you interpret that sort of evidence. Which takes us then to arguments for the death penalty and arguments against the death penalty. And again, just like with private prisons, there's a lot of arguments for it and there's a lot of arguments against it. And I think hopefully, whatever your opinion is, you will soften it up a little and recognize that the other point of view is more legitimate than you've probably been giving them credit for. So obviously, one of the big arguments for the death penalty is incapacitation, right? And that is you're taking away the capacity of an offender to commit new offenses. Obviously, if you kill somebody, that is the ultimate incapacitation. They will never commit another offense again. Of course, life without parole also does that. People who get life without parole, they go away forever, right? That literally is without parole, so they spend a life in prison. So that also will incapacitate. There's an argument for deterrence, right? And so you have specific deterrence. Obviously, if you kill the individual, that individual cannot commit another offense. You have specifically deterred them from ever killing again. Where it gets a little sketchy is this argument for general deterrence. Most of the research on the death penalty finds that it has no deterrent value. And criminologists study this in a couple of ways. They look at states that maybe get rid of the death penalty, and they follow them over time, and they look to see if the murder rate changes between the time they had the death penalty and then after when they get rid of the death penalty. And what they find is it usually doesn't change all that much. And then they'll also look at states that have the death penalty versus states that don't have the death penalty, that are contiguous, that are close to each other, so that you're controlling for region and that sort of thing. And so what they find then is the states that with the death penalty and states without the death penalty, don't have different rates of capital offenses, which again, it's just murder for the most part. And so there's not a whole lot of evidence that the threat of the death penalty actually deters people from committing murder. And this, I think, is probably the strongest argument for the death penalty. Is some people say, well, look, it's morally just. Who cares whether it deters? Right? That's not the issue. The issue is when you look at a crime like what we just saw, there's no other morally just punishment. And this goes back again to Immanuel Kant, who argued that you have to, even if a society was breaking up and it wasn't going to be society anymore, you still have a moral obligation to punish all the criminals, all the offenders, because that's the morally just thing to do, right? It's a moral imperative to punish them. You have to do that regardless, because again, rehabilitation's not the point, deterrence isn't the point. You're not going to be a society anymore tomorrow, but they still all need to be punished. And so that's, I think, probably the strongest argument for the death penalty, is this argument that, well, some crimes just deserve that. It's proportional. So that's an argument for proportionality, which of course we generally try to shoot for, which definitely was argued strongly for with the Enlightenment. And that's been a major component of punishment in the West and in most places. And that is that if somebody kills, the proportional punishment for that is to be killed, right? And again, if you look at that crime that went way beyond killing, it was killing with lots of aggravating circumstances. That's the only punishment that's proportional to the offense. Importantly, it reflects public opinion. So roughly 2/3, 65% of Americans support the death penalty. And in the end, this is a democracy. And so whether you support the death penalty or not, if 2/3 of the population supports the death penalty, then that's reason enough for the death penalty. That's what people want by quite a bit. And so that's another argument. And then going back to this idea of, well, we have a lot of people who've been exonerated with DNA evidence. We have lots and lots of appeals. As we talked about, it takes a long time to finally be executed. And so there's a lot of review. So the argument is that, look, there's a very small chance of error. Again, the argument is that almost by definition, by finding these cases where we've exonerated people, is evidence that we're not making mistakes. And equally, there's a lot of arguments against the death penalty. Number one is, well, that's not true at all. There's a lot of error. Look at all the people who've been exonerated because of DNA evidence. If you go back prior to DNA evidence, people have been executed who were innocent. And, a lot of people are convicted by eyewitness testimony. Eyewitness testimony is famously bad. And so a lot of people have kind of poor defense representation during their trials. And so there's a lot of chance for error. And in fact, again, that's why in Illinois that the governor just commuted all the death sentences. And that's really becoming one of the strongest arguments against the death penalty. Is increasingly we're finding that innocent people are getting convicted, not just of capital offenses, but of other offenses. The unfair use of discretion. So what we have found, as we saw, is that the biggest predictor of whether or not you get the death penalty is the race of your victim. And so that's clearly unfair use of discretion coming in. We know that the worst offenders don't necessarily get the death penalty, that there's all kinds of other predictors as to whether you're actually going to get executed based on things like your defense representation, and more importantly, the race of the victim combined with the race of the offender. So there is still racial bias in the use of the death penalty, and that's obviously not fair. As I just said, most serious criminals escape death. So you have a lot of factors factoring into whether or not somebody gets the death penalty. And so you could have a lot of people who committed some of the most heinous offenses. They don't get the death penalty. Other people committed somewhat less heinous offenses. They do get the death penalty. And so there is this question of fairness. Other people argue sort of against this idea of just desserts, or that it's the only just punishment. And a lot of people argue that a lot of the just desserts and retribution is really just vengeance. And it's a natural thing to want. We all want that. If a loved one of mine, if, my family member was murdered and raped and had all these horrible things go through, without a doubt, I'd want that person killed. I have no doubt I'd want the offender to be executed. The problem is that's what I want, and that is a question of whether or not that's a good way to build government and build a criminal justice system. And so it's not the state's place to implement revenge, right? It's the state's place to maintain order and to represent all sides, et cetera, et cetera. So some people would argue that it's not that revenge should not be part of a punishment. And again, going back to the deterrence, there's questionable evidence that it actually deters. Obviously, it specifically deters, but as far as general deterrence goes, there's not real strong evidence that it deters. And then there's been arguments that there's actually a brutalizing effect, and that is there was kind of a famous study done. It was a while ago. And the researcher found that immediately after a highly publicized execution, violent crimes went up. And he argued that this was because of a brutalizing effect, that people see the state executing somebody, people see the state using violence to settle a conflict, to resolve a crime, and that tells them that's okay, that it's okay to use violence to resolve your disputes. And so that explains then within 24 to 48 hours after a highly publicized, it has to be a highly publicized execution, the researchers saw this increase in violent crimes. Other researchers have not necessarily replicated that finding, so that's kind of to me, it's a pretty weak argument. I don't think there's a lot of evidence for the brutalization effect, but it is an interesting argument nevertheless. I think a really strong argument against the death penalty is just how expensive it is, right? It is more expensive to execute someone than it is to give them life without parole. And the reason for that is, of course, all the appeals, and you want all the appeals because of the possibility of error. You do not want to execute somebody who did not commit that crime at all. And so you have to have all these appeals. But the problem is, at some point, that actually becomes more expensive than simply putting them in prison for life without parole. And so, from just a cost benefit point of view, if you can achieve incapacitation, specific deterrence through life without parole, and it's cheaper than the death penalty. And then there's also the idea that, well, if a mistake is made, even if it's 15 years later, they can exonerate that person. Well, it's at least that person's not dead and can be exonerated. So the argument is then, look, from a cost benefit point of view, it just doesn't make sense to use the death penalty because it costs more than life without parole, plus all these other problems.